Welcome back to another episode of Impossible Equals Impossible. And man, am I so fired up for this episode. It's so fascinating, right? Every time you bring somebody on, it's always a new story, but this one I'm really excited about because as a lot of you know, right, I've been talking about it for the past couple weeks or so. Tomorrow I leave with a few members of my community, the Outlier Project, and we're actually heading to Nicaragua for our first humanity expedition. And it's going to be a first experience for all of us. And when we're talking about this idea of, impossible equals I'm possible, the power of possibility becomes so powerful, right? And the person that we're gonna bring on shortly is has an incredible story, right? I just found out that he's been in Nicaragua longer than I've been alive, so that's that's been a fascinating journey. But I just love learning stories and about why people do the work that they do, right? It becomes powerful. It allows you to create connections with people. And this experience is exactly what was the intention of this show, right? To inspire others to chase their potential instead of accepting their reality. So, my guest tonight is Peter Schaller, and he has an amazing story. Can't wait to dive in. But he's been a community development specialist with more than 25 years of experience designing development programs and social services in the US and Latin America. He has a master's in public administration and is completing a PhD in environmental conservation and restoration. He currently runs Rayo de Sol, an Atlanta based nonprofit implementing community development strategies in Nicaragua. Peter is married and has three children and two grandsons. His passions are running, hiking, reading, writing, and photography. And with no further ado, we're going to bring on our guest tonight, Mr. Peter Schaller. Pete, thank you so much for being here. So grateful to have you here. And yeah, welcome.
Hey Paul, yeah, thank you so much for creating this space. I'm really glad to be here and to share this conversation with you tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. And where I always love to start, right, Pete, is like so many times on social media, people get to see kind of the finished product, right? Like where people are at. They don't really get to see a lot of the journey, right? And we were just kind of talking before that you were born and raised like in the US. Tell us a little bit of kind of your story like growing up and how did you kind of find your way to Nicaragua?
Oh gosh, that's a long winding road, so I'll see if I can shorten it a little bit. You're right. I was born and raised in Connecticut on the Connecticut shoreline, just outside of New Haven. As most people probably know, it's a very affluent area, especially in recent years. You know, a lot of people from New York have moved out into Connecticut because it's a little bit less expensive. Real estate's less expensive, but it also drives real estate prices up in the Connecticut shoreline. So it's one of probably the wealthiest, the greatest concentrations of wealth in the United States in the Northeastern corridor. And I grew up, in a small town where, probably 90% of the kids that graduated from our high school went to college, and we're sort of expected to follow the same, path to go to college, get a degree, become some kind of professional, buy a big house, and kind of keep the cycle going. And at some point, when I was still in high school, I realized that the world was not the place that I wanted it to be, that there were a lot of problems that needed to be addressed. I first got involved in environmental organizations, I would say early on, before climate change was even a phrase. We talked about global warming, in the 80s and 90s, and then realized that environmental activism was important, but there were a lot of people that didn't have their basic needs met. So I remember a very long conversation with a close friend who convinced me that you can't expect people to be concerned about environmental issues if they don't have their basic needs met, if they don't have food on the table. And at that point, I sort of switched my focus to working with people living in poverty and in precarious conditions. So I worked for a few years, still in the U.S. with homeless folks in Virginia, and then also worked with severely disabled adults in Arizona. and came to Nicaragua as a volunteer first, and was just blown away by the depth and the breadth of the poverty here. Because I mean, there are a lot of people in the United States that live below the poverty line and have great needs, but it can't really be compared to developing countries where there's so many um, gaps in social service provision and so much less available to people. So it's not that not to belittle needs that people might have in the U.S., especially the homeless population, but honestly, the need in not just Nicaragua, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, and Africa is much greater than probably almost anything that we can experience in the United States. So came as a volunteer, got a paying job offer about a year later, and then just made it, sort of my life's work to stay here and work in community development.
Yeah, that's powerful. And I can relate too, because I was born and raised in Hawaii, which, there's abundance, wealth, like one of the most expensive places to live in the world. And there were so many people who were barely able to get by, but there was so much like assistance, right, from like social services and like programs and all these things. So I hear what you're saying, because in Nicaragua, like, you don't have the programs that we do in the US. That's essentially why you're there, right? That's your job, is to be kind of the program that you want to see, right? You saw that there was a need for it, and you kind of created an organization to do that. I'm I'm curious for you, like, there must be like a lot of drastic changes, right? Living in Nicaragua, and then kind of being able to correlate that with how you grew up in the US. What was really like one of the biggest challenges for you to adjust that drastic lifestyle shift? And what how did you manage to come to terms with it? Because I feel like for a lot of people that I see, right, when you kind of immerse yourself in that environment, it changes the way that you live, right? Your idea
Mhm.
of what's important and where you invest your money and time changes versus where a lot of like normal people would do it. So I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's definitely. I mean, there's much less abundance. I think in the United States, and I travel back and forth. I probably make 3 trips a year or so to the U.S. Mostly, fundraising work trips, and occasionally visit family and friends and things like that. And I always kind of bottom out after about 3 or 4 days. When you get there and it's kind of in this euphoria, visiting people, and traveling anywhere is always exciting. So you're kind of riding on this excitement, and then I always kind of bottom out when I go into a super grocery store, or one of those mega WalMarts or something, because you see so much abundance, and so many people that are consuming things that they don't really need, spending money like crazy on things that are really unnecessary, when we live side by side every day with people who don't have their basic needs met. People that don't have enough food on the table, and people who can't afford to send their kids to school, so their kids are out working in the streets. And kids that don't have shoes to go to school, and so it's hard. And I always kind of bottom out, and that's I would say I'll probably never get over that. Reverse culture shock is also. I remember after I was here first, I came as a volunteer, and I was here for 3 months and lived in a rural community with a family in a very remote area. And I remember that the culture shock for me flying back to the Miami airport was greater than flying from Miami to Nicaragua. Just going back to that, like this culture where there's just so much all the time, and you see people, kind of on the wheel spinning to get a larger television or a newer car or a bigger house or something that's bigger, faster, stronger. And that's it's hard to process a lot of the time. So that for me is something that I hope I never do get over it, because if I ever get over it, that means I stop feeling that difference. But which is not to say that I'm not trying to criticize the way people live. I mean, everybody decides how they want to live their lives. But we could all probably be a lot more conservative in our expenses and our consumption, and sort of level the playing field out for those who have so much less.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because I never really talked about it, but like one of the things that I was really kind of like afraid of is, like, naturally I'm a very like patient person. I understand a lot of perspective and all these things. But I even have like such a hard time understanding why so many people, especially like in my generation, complain, because Sure, like the cost of living is expensive and like housing is going up and all these things, but there's so much more accessibility and possibility that you have to overcome that now versus they kind of did then. And the question that I kind of wanna ask you is, what was the kind of turning point for you when everything like really clicked? Because one of the things that I've been telling myself right as we gear up for this trip is, as much as possible, just be present in the moment, right? And really just appreciate a lot of the things that I think so many people don't really. I always like to say that there's a lot of things that we like see, but we don't actually like see, right? You just walk past it and all of these things. How have you really been able to kind of immerse yourself in the culture and not letting that kind of lose faint, right? Because you're always traveling, going to different places, but you always take it with you when you go. How has that been? How have you been able to kind of like sustain that, I guess, would be my question.
Well, I think wherever we are, we have to really find value in any place. I tell my wife this all the time. I mean, you could basically drop me out of an airplane blindfolded anywhere, and I could pretty much be happy living about anywhere, because you got to really appreciate where you're, like you said, be in the moment and appreciate everything that's there. So, on one hand, there's a lot of shortage here. Like right now, for example, we always have water shortages. There's no water in my house. When I live a pretty solid middle class life here. My wife works, I work. We're pretty well off compared to a lot of people we work with. Um, but we don't have water half the time, so you got to fill up buckets and barrels, and the power goes out, and there's not enough water, and sometimes you go to the grocery store and there just like aren't things that you want to find, and so there's a lot of shortage like that. But at the same time, there's a richness here, and a lot of people ask me, when they come to visit, like, why do you live there? Why do you stay so long? And it's family and community, because those are two pillars that are still so relevant today. And it's not that that's completely lost in the United States, but I think we could probably all argue that they're highly endangered. They're on the endangered species list. Certainly in the Northeast, I mean, I've seen so many families that are, you know, I think dysfunctional has become kind of a popular word, but families that aren't really very tight and aren't very unified and aren't very strong. Um, I think today people have gotten accustomed to creating communities that aren't organic and natural, but we make intentional communities by seeking out people that we want to connect with. But there's a lot to be said for the organic process of living in a community, be side by side with people that you don't necessarily agree with. You might not agree on politics, you might not go to the same church, but you share the same space and you're part of a community. And that, in large part, it has been lost in the United States, and it's still very alive and vibrant here. So there's sort of a trade-off. Fortunately, I mean, I have a friend who was a consultant from Cuba, and he always said the best way to help the poor is not being one of them. And I agree. I mean, I don't want to be poor. I mean, I live in a house with a good roof, and drive a car back and forth to work. I mean, that's rich. But at the same time, you kind of just learn to live with the limitations and really value those things, the social network and the social fabric that really make our lives rich. And that's where I've found, so much wealth here and so much abundance, that it's what I most love about living here. And so you kind of find this balance between, the material side and the social networking side, which really enriches our lives.
Yeah, so powerful. And I want to say hello to some friends who hopped in. Jackie, so good to see you, my friend. If you haven't, you definitely have to connect with Pete. Jackie's also in the nonprofit space. She helps a lot of with I'm trying to think of the term social. I know it's like social justice, but a lot of like prison reform, I believe, is a lot of the nature
Oh
of her
yeah, yeah.
work. And Timothy's here. Good to see you, Timothy. Thank you so much for being here. Pete, where I want to go next is, and this is something that I'll admit I was kind of guilty of, right? So much in the US, like there's a lot of like media manipulation when it comes to a lot of these like foreign countries, and especially a lot of the developing nations. I remember when I went to Mexico in 2022. That was my first international trip, and you hear so much about the negativity. And I remember when I told a bunch of like my family members and friends that I was going to be going to Nicaragua, the first thought for them is, oh, like, oh, be safe, right? Like, how people like always have this kind of negative connotation. And when we hopped on our Zoom call where you kind of like went over everything, that was like the first thing that you addressed was you're like, okay, everyone, first, I want you to know that a lot of the stuff that you hear isn't necessarily true. Like, it's pretty safe, and there's a lot of, misinformation, manipulation. When you first went to Nicaragua, and maybe like the media wasn't as big that back then as it is now, but was that something that you were kind of concerned of? Because like, growing up in the US, going to school and all these things, like, you're kind of told all these things. Was that something for you that you were afraid of? And how how does it kind of make you feel that this is kind of the narrative that so many people are pushing, and the fact that you've been there for nearly, gosh, like 30 years, right? Like, you've been able to prove how inaccurate that is.
Yeah, that's a big one because it has enormous repercussions, and that's what a lot of people don't realize. So Nicaragua, like a lot of Latin American countries, has had quite a political history. There was a dictatorship. I'll make this very brief, but there was a dictatorship through most of the first half of the first 2/3 of the 20th century, and then the dictatorship was overthrown by the Sandinistas, who were during the Cold War supported by the Soviet Union and Cuba. And so from that time forward, well, the U.S. has had intervention in Nicaragua since the 1880s, so it's not a recent thing. I mean, the political history between the United States and Nicaragua goes back more than 100 years, almost 150 years. And the United States, I mean, I don't want to get too deep into politics. I don't want to set anybody off, but the United States foreign policy will always protect economic interest above all else. That's just the way it is. I mean, we could argue all night about that, but if you really look into it, that's what happens. So the United States was always protecting economic interest here. In recent years, we've seen a resurgence because the Sandinistas are governing again, and they were the party that was affiliated with the Soviet Union. There's a lot of concern in the United States about the type of government that's here and representation. And so what I mentioned on our call was if you go to the State Department travel advisory for Nicaragua, it's a level 3, which is just short of all-out civil war. That's what it says on the page, and that is largely used as a deterrent for tourism and foreign investment. So if you want to cripple a country whose government you're in disagreement with, what better way than to affect the country's economy? And that does not require Congress approving legislation. So it's easier for some policy analysts at the State Department to do a travel advisory for Nicaragua, just get it signed off on by his supervisor, and then it's public information. The truth is quite the opposite. I mean, there's risk anywhere in the world you go. There's risk. I was telling one of the members of the group today, I mean, I can never promise you that nobody's going to get sick, that nobody's going to get hurt. I mean, you never know what's going to happen. But I will say this, and I also hope I don't ruffle any feathers, but I'm much more concerned about somebody shooting me when I get to the United States than I am about any kind of personal danger here in Nicaragua. The United States right now has one of the worst gun epidemic, the worst violence epidemic on the planet. And that's not really talked about. But, Nicaragua, because it has such a sort of convoluted political history, is always sort of deemed a dangerous country. But I think you'll see in 24 hours time that you'll be surrounded by friendly, loving people who will, hug you and welcome you into their community and be really glad to see you.
Yeah, powerful. And I normally, like, I don't talk about politics much, but I feel like that was such a powerful example because, I mean, let's face it, right? When you're in a foreign country, it's there's going to be like some political ramifications when you're so influenced by a lot of the bigger countries and superpowers. You had talked about something a little previously about like family and community, right? And I think that for a lot of us on LinkedIn, that's why many people choose LinkedIn. I always like to say, like, maybe people will come for like the lead generation or to get a job, but you end up staying for the relationships and the community that you build. But really taking community to the next level has been the Outlier Project. I know for me, I've been pretty open about how much of a game changer it's been. You know, Scott has been an incredible mentor and friend to me. And I know that because you grew up with him, I kind of have like a two-part question. I'm curious because we read in the bio, right? You have 3 kids and 2 grandsons. Are they all with you in Nicaragua? And then what has the Outlier Project meant to you personally?
Yeah, great question. So family is very important. I am in a second marriage, so unfortunately my first marriage was disastrous, but I have 3 beautiful kids that came out of it. And my oldest son has 2 children. So it's really common in Latin American culture for young adults to stay with the family, right? Which is, for me, has been a little bit of a, sort of a strange tension, because I grew up in the United States. I've been independent from my family since I was 17 years old, and I've always been fiercely independent. So to have adult children living at home for me is really required me to sort of revisit, what does family really mean, and how long do you really want your kids to be around for, and why do we really kick kids out of the nest when they're old enough to go off to college? I mean, there are a lot of questions. I don't know which answer is right or wrong, but yeah. So most of our kids do live with us, and with my wife and I. She has 2 sons, and I have 3. So of the 5 combined children, 4 of them live with us. And it can be challenging at times, but then you remember that that's what we're here for. And oh gosh, sorry, I drew a blank on part 2 of the question.
Oh, part two was about the Outlier Project and what has kind of
Oh
like
yeah,
your relationship with Scott meant to you and just the community.
yeah, absolutely. So I had seen Scott um, posting a lot of things, and it used to be called Talent Champions Council when he started it, and I just sort of peripherally noticed he had this activity going on, and one day I just really woke up and said, wait a minute, Scott is doing something very unique. He's attracting some incredibly interesting and accomplished people, accomplished in the broadest sense of the word, not just professionally, but as human beings. I think what really has impacted me is that it is a community of people that aren't just there because they want to, sort of promote their professional accomplishments, but to really delve into what it means to be a balanced and integral human being. Obviously, our professional lives is a big part of that, because I spend a lot more hours working than I do with my family, right? So I mean, I've got to really focus on what do I want that to mean. I mean, what's the impact I want to leave on the world, and but there's a lot more to it than just work. So I found that in the Outlier Project, there are a lot of people like you and like everybody else that's coming tomorrow, and hundreds of others that have joined the Outlier Project, that are concerned not just about what does my resume look like, but what is my legacy? What's my family going to remember about me? What are my friends going to remember about me? What is my community going to remember about me? And that to me is so fulfilling, to talk to other people that see all the different aspects of life as equally important. Because I think a lot of us know people that focus their whole lives on work and money and work and money and work and money, and they retire and they've got a pile of money, and then what? Right? So if you're alone in an empty house with a huge bank account, what does it matter? you know but if you might have financial success, but if you've also balanced that with a strong marriage, or relationship with your kids,
Mm.
or having a network of close friends, being involved in volunteer work and whatever it might be. But I mean, if you round out your life like that, then that's what we have to leave, and that's the kind of people that I found in the Outlier projects.
Yeah, powerful. I couldn't agree more. I think you just find that so many people, pretty much everybody, honestly, in the community is just like a giver, right? Like we want to give and help others more than we take from the community. And I mean, it's almost kind of like hard to do when the people that we get introduced to, it's like, man, it's like, how do you give back? But the thing that I love so much about it is, growing up I did a lot of community service, right? And you and I kind of talked about that in the pre-live, but I don't really think that I ever had the opportunity to go travel internationally and like actually do it. And what's been so unique for me on LinkedIn is that I've been able to interact and like meet people all over the world. And in a way, just from like having conversations and building relationships with people, you feel like you can kind of understand a bit of like what day-to-day life kind of looks like for them, a lot of the challenges and things that they're trying to do, or things that we have that they don't, and vice versa. But being in the actual environment, like actually being there physically, is going to be a completely different experience. I kind of want to go back because I'm really intrigued. You talked about how you've been independent from your family pretty much since you've been 17. And I can relate because for me, I supported my family financially in Hawaii since I was 17. 17 was kind
Hmm.
of the coming of age year, I guess
Hmm.
you would say, for me.
Yeah.
And I'm really curious for you, like what kind of was it like on along your childhood that kind of led you to the point of where you were just going to do your own thing? Because I know for me, I always felt like I was an outlier, right? Like I just wasn't like anybody that I was around. I saw things differently. Kind of uh, growing up for me, like I grew up with my grandparents, and it was kind of like I lived this double life, right? Like you grew up old school and you have these old school values, but then growing up, going to school, interacting with a lot of the people that I did was kind of like two different worlds. Did you kind of have that same experience as well?
I did, absolutely. And I can't remember, I can't really pinpoint like an exact event or something like that that sort of tipped the scales, but I do remember, maybe in my third or fourth year of high school, just kind of realizing that I was drifting in a different direction than my friends were. I grew up in, like I said, an affluent area, and people were focused on going to college and having a career and making money. And those were the things that I was taught to measure. And I just got an inkling. Um, my mom was sort of involved in activism a little bit. My uncle, pretty heavily in activism, so that they definitely had an influence. But I realized I wanted to measure different things, and so at that stage in my life, and at the time I had no idea what I was doing, but I look back on it now, and I can see it was a great decision. I made a terribly wrong turn, and I decided not to go to college. It was mostly uh, out of rebellion against my dad. Was a judge. He'd gone to Yale and Yale Law School, and he was a very accomplished legal professional. And of course, he was pressuring me to go to college, and I just kind of like, I want to buck the system, and I said, no, I'm going to keep roofing houses. And and I spent a couple of years, and I didn't do a lot of good things. I mean, I got into trouble and was just working a blue collar life and paying rent, and then realized that there was a lot more to do with this life, and that's why I decided to go back to school. If I had not made that decision at that point, I don't think I would have ended up on this path. I mean, if I had just gone into college and picked any major and studied anything just to get a 4-year degree and kind of fit into the life I was expected to live, I don't think any of this would have happened. So it looks, if I look back on the roadmap of my life, it looks like a wrong turn, but it actually led me to exactly the place I was supposed to end up.
Yeah, for sure. I love the fact that you've had kind of like some experience, right? Like you said, your mom and your uncle kind of had did like a little bit of activism, which is kind of similar to the work that you're doing now. And that's a really cool story. And I love what you shared about how you kind of had to redefine what success looked like, right? And that was even something for me. I remember it was 2022. It was the last thing that I had done on my list of things that I didn't ever think that I would do, which in many instances is what inspired this show. And I remember like doing that thing, and I didn't feel like empty, but I just didn't feel like how I thought I was gonna feel when you did it. And I'm curious for you because I know for me last year was a really big turning point, of a massive shift in self-awareness and realizing that, oh my goodness, like so many times people are like chasing things and they're focusing on kind of what success looks like versus what it feels like, and what and in the being of their experience, right? You had kind of talked about it earlier. So many times you see people who have a ton of money, but it's at the expense of their health or their family and relationships. And it's really fascinating how you've been able to kind of find that like harmony of, you know, work, family, personal, professional. What were like some of the key things that allowed you to kind of do that? And I'm curious for you, Pete, what is like your definition of success?
Oh gosh, that's that's a big question. Um, you know, I strongly believe that all of us on the planet have an obligation, you know, to leave this world a better place than we found it. You know, one of my favorite poets is Gary Snyder, who's, I don't, a lot of people probably haven't heard him. He's actually from the Beat generation. I think he's like 95 years old right now, but still alive. Lives in California. And there's a phrase that he said: "Find your place on the planet, dig in, and take responsibility from there." And so, you know, for me, my place on the planet ended up being here in Nicaragua. I mean, it could be anywhere. It could be Detroit. It could be Zimbabwe. You know, it could be Thailand. It doesn't really matter where. But to me, success is that. I mean, you know, we all need to work, and you know, I've got bills to pay too, and I got kids to get through college, and you know, groceries to buy. So I need to make money, but I want my impact in the world to be something more that, you know, he showed up for work every day. And every once in a while, I'll come across or run into, you know, somebody that I've worked. So since I've been here, I've worked with 3 different organizations. I've had 3 long-term positions with, you know, development organizations, and so I've met a lot of people, and you know, helped a lot of kids, like probably thousands, like through school. And so every once in a while, you run into somebody, and they'll be like, "Hey, remember me? You know, my name is so and so, and you know, back in, you know, such and such a year, I had this opportunity, and I did this, and you know, never would have gotten here." And it's like, man, even if it was that one person, you know, that one kid that took advantage of that opportunity and turned their lives around and did something with it, you know, besides just the status quo, then it's all really worthwhile. And so success is, you know, how can you make an impact that somehow, you know, leaves this place cleaner and better and more just than it was before. Um, I think we all have an obligation to serve, and it really doesn't matter which religion you profess to. I mean, our organization is a non-denominational Christian organization. I grew up in the Episcopalian Church, ran away as far away from Christianity as I could when I was old enough to, and then I've come back to actually read the teachings and to read the gospel and to read Paul's letters and to find so much truth there. But I've also studied other world religions, and you cannot name a religion on this planet that does not prioritize taking care of the most vulnerable people in society. You can find it in Christianity, you can find it in Judaism, you can find it in Islam, you will find it in Buddhism, you will find it in Hinduism. It's everywhere. So no matter what belief system you have, that's our first responsibility. So for me, that's where success really starts. And how each person decides to define that and how you want to manifest it is really up to them. I would love for more people to get involved with our organization, obviously. But I understand if somebody says, "Oh, that's great what you're doing. You've just inspired me to, you know, to volunteer at a soup kitchen in Cincinnati, Ohio." Fantastic. You know, that's a job well done.
No, it's really powerful. Like I'll probably end up doing it sometime this year, but I always wanted to do that. Was just like, you know, spending Thanksgiving or Christmas like in a place where they're not as like privileged, you know, because it's like so many times we get caught up in the vanity of it all, and the message of a lot of things loses track. I'm really curious because you had mentioned that you still have like some kids and stuff going to college, and you know ultimately you'll have kind of some of your grandkids there at that point. How is college different in Nicaragua versus in the U.S.? Because I don't want to speak for other people, but I know from my experience, right? Like even college is getting like really political. Like they have their agendas and all these things, and it's like absurd amount of money now, and you're finding so many people that like go to college, yet they have they have this piece of paper, this degree, all this debt, and they're not even able to find a job. So I'm curious, like, how does college work in Nicaragua? Are people able to like transition really quickly from like college to the workforce? Like, what can you kind of share about that?
It is a much different system, and in fact, the government has been sort of centralizing the education system over the past several years, and actually trying to fulfill Bernie Sanders' dream of making higher education free and accessible to everyone. And so far, they're doing a pretty good job at it. Obviously, the quality sometimes can be somewhat questionable, but they are working to make higher education free of cost or minimal cost and more accessible to people from lower income communities. And it's rare for a university to have dorms or anything like that. Most kids are from the locality and go to classes during the day and live at home. So it's a different experience in that sense, where it's not like where kids are all of a sudden independent, and living away from home. Like my daughter, who's the youngest of my three kids, is in her first year at the university in Managua, when she goes to classes for about 5 or 6 hours a day, every day, and and she meets new students and is involved in things, but that's the extent of it. Our hope is that there are job opportunities. When kids do graduate, we promote technical school a lot as well, because a lot of times the trades, and that's true in the United States too, the trades can be more more effective for kids finding steady employment, and not having to sort of sacrifice all their years of study to get into any kind of a job. And in an economy like Nicaragua's economy, which is still largely supported by small businesses, there's also a culture that's sort of ripe for entrepreneurship. So it's very common for many families to operate some kind of small business, oftentimes out of their home. So as you'll see in a day or two, a lot of families will just have like a small store in their home where they sell, like some basic staple foods and snacks and things like that. And it's just kind of one little room in the house where they sell things. Or, people will make tortillas and then just pull a little, iron plate out with a stove in the morning and make tortillas, and then they put it away at night, and that's how they make their income. So, if kids can't find formal employment in their chosen professional field, we also in our organization promote entrepreneurship and microloans to get small business started.
Wow. That's really insightful. I love what you guys are doing with, making like college like accessible and universal, because I feel like it should be to a point, right, where people need accessibility, even though all the technological resources that we have. But in some place like Nicaragua, you don't have, right, the abundance that we do in the US. I always love asking this question, because everybody who knows me knows like I'm kind of obsessed with personal development. It's been an absolute game changer for me. I'm curious, Pete, do you have somebody, whether it's like a mentor, a family member, friend? I'm curious for you, like, who's been the most kind of impactful person on your journey, either personally or professionally, and what was the most valuable lesson that they've taught you?
Yeah, that's you got some great questions, Paul. Thank you. These are not softballs. These are like sliders coming in at 90 miles an hour. Um, I believe heavily in mentorship, so that's a great question for me, and I could probably name many different mentors that have played key roles during my life. I would go back to my uncle. I have a very small family, so my dad was an only child, and my mother has only one brother, so I have one uncle and two cousins. I was always so jealous of my friends that had these family reunions with uncles and aunts and cousins. And my uncle, also grew up in Connecticut in a pretty privileged environment, went to Yale as well, and then decided to go to Mexico and Central America and volunteer. And so he got very immersed in Latin American culture. And when I was growing up, I didn't see him that much, but that was who he was. He was like this really exotic person who was not only traveling to interesting places, but was also doing things that never heard about in my family. My parents were fairly conservative, and never talked about social issues or political issues much at all. So when I decided to leave Connecticut, I moved in with my uncle for a year in Virginia, and that's how I ended up getting back to school because I got residency there and got to see firsthand, what his life had been like. He settled in Virginia and was operating a program at that time for homeless men in Lynchburg, Virginia. And I never knew up until then that you could actually make a living and support your family and make a career out of social services. I always thought that activism and volunteerism was sort of something you did on the side, in your free time. And he and his wife showed me that that could be your life. And you really were never going to get rich or have a whole lot of material comforts, but that you could make a good life, a good middle class life for yourself, and dedicate your life to service. So of the many mentors, he is definitely the first one that comes to mind.
Yeah, that's powerful. It's so fascinating because I talk about my aunt all the time, and in many ways, like my aunt is kind of the reason why I help people because she's really similar. Like she doesn't care about materialistic things, money. She just loves like helping people, and it's always been about kind of the impact with her. So I love, and that's so cool. Like I wouldn't have known that you have this really small family. It's funny because like your family that you have now is like bigger than the family that you grew up in. We in the bio we had talked about how you got your master's degree and then you're currently going for your PhD. Clearly education is extremely valuable not just to you but it is something that you prioritize like within your family. I'm curious for you, like what was the inspiration behind getting like a PhD? Is there like some type of story or is it just like expand your education so that it'll help you kind of maybe qualify, get more like grants, funding? I'm just kind of curious, like why did you decide to pursue a PhD?
Yeah, so I definitely can attribute my academic goals to my dad. So, having butted heads a lot with my dad when I was growing up, because we're on opposite ends of the political spectrum. I later, as an adult, and especially as a parent, really appreciated who he was. And my dad was, he, like I said, he was a judge. He'd gone to Yale and Yale Law School, and continued to take courses and to teach and to write. And so I also learned my reading habit from him. I'm an avid reader, and I learned that from him. So I think I've always had sort of a lifelong pursuit, of learning and knowledge. In this case, the timing is right because we don't have small kids anymore, so we don't have to really. My time at the end of the day after work is pretty much mine, and because my wife and I actually work in different parts of the country, so we spend a lot of the weekdays apart, and then we're traveling together on the weekend. So that's common here because employment is so scarce. So the timing just seemed right, and like I mentioned a few minutes ago, when I was a teenager, I became really concerned and interested in environmental issues, and I never abandoned that, despite the fact that I sort of shifted to working, on issues of poverty. I always carried that with me, but I never had any professional or academic, um, experience in environmental issues. So I figured it was a good time. The climate crisis is going to affect developing countries a lot more than developed countries. Just because of economics and the social system. So a country like Nicaragua is actually extremely vulnerable to the impacts of the climate crisis. We have very long stretches of coast on the Atlantic and Pacific. Heavy amount of forest lost, and we have been incorporating climate change mitigation into a lot of our programming. And I felt like it was a good time for me to have a more solid base. This is obviously helpful in the practical for designing and implementing our programs, and also for applying for grants. It's always
All right.
good when you're applying for a grant if you have somebody with academic professional expertise on staff, that can sort of spearhead any kind of project. So it's personal. It's definitely personal because I've enjoyed learning more. I learned in this process that I had a very weak background in science, so I had to do a lot of catching up. It's one thing to be concerned about the environment. It's a whole other thing to understand the science behind it. And also professionally, in our organization, it's already had a very positive impact. We had, I had to do some research, and I tied my thesis research into some activities that we are already promoting within our organization, and how to do a lot of surveys and interviews and things like that. And all of those materials have actually already been incorporated into some grant proposals. So, my personal goal of achieving a PhD, which led to doing research, has provided information that is now helping us, to apply for funding. So it really is a benefit to, to me personally, to the organization, and hopefully to my family and this country.
Wow, that's incredible. This is why I love like having these conversations. You get to learn so much in such a short time. Pete, I can't believe I just realized like, oh, we've been talking about it, but I don't think we really introduced it. Can you kind of tell everybody about Rayo de Sol and how did you create it? What was kind of the intention, and where do you kind of see it going within the next couple years?
Sure. So, like I mentioned, I've had 3 long-term positions here, and before this organization, I was working for another much larger organization here in Nicaragua, and got a random email from a friend one day. Said, "Hey, these guys from Atlanta called me, and they've set up a 501(c)(3) in the U.S. And they were from the same church, and they belonged to a group together. They wanted to do something, altruistic with their economic resources. Would you be interested in talking to them?" And this is one piece of advice, in case there's anybody that's younger and up and coming in their careers. I tell all the young people I meet this: always follow up on a lead. I found that, like, sometimes I'll send an email and people won't answer. I'm like, really, seriously? I mean, I always follow up on a lead. Sometimes it doesn't go anywhere, and you can drop it and say, okay, that wasn't worth the time. But had so many good things come, personally and professionally, by just taking the time to follow up on a lead. So I did. I followed up, called them. They came for a visit, visited the organization I was working for. We set up a small pilot project. And then a couple of years later, this was in 2013, I decided, for personal reasons, to leave that job. And I said, look, we've got some experience, we've got contacts, we've got some donors. If you guys want, we can go solo with this and really grow it. And that was, 10 years ago. We started out with a staff of, 2.5 people, because we had one person who was part-time, about a $75,000 budget. And over the course of 10 years, we now have, I think our staff is up to about 20. Last year, I don't want to say spent, I like to say invested, altogether about $900,000, but 200,000 of that was in our office. So in terms of program expenses, $700,000. So we've essentially grown our budget tenfold over 10 years, our staffing as well, and obviously the amount of impact we can generate. So we have 5 main program areas. One is spiritual growth. Like I said, we're a faith-based organization, but it's a very inclusive initiative. We just kind of create a space where people can explore their faith, from whatever perspective we're coming from. We work in primary education. We have a working agreement with the Ministry of Education, which gives us access to having direct incidents in the public school system. So we work with 41 public schools, and that benefits about 5,100 students. We have a youth program because it's really hard for kids to stay in school. There's a lot of expectation that they will, go to work at a young age and contribute to the family economy. Probably a lot like your experience.
Yeah.
So we have a scholarship program for high school, technical, and university students. We have about 800 kids in that program. We have a health program that it was sort of nominal until COVID hit, and we saw a lot of organizations closing their doors around us with the risk. Obviously all across the planet, nobody knew what was going on, where it was going. And we made a very conscious decision to not to close our doors, but to go deeper in health. So we hired a physician at that time, and we've sort of built out over the past 3 years a more robust community health program where we provide, primary care services and public health education. You'll see that up close and personal Friday. And we have a community development program which focuses more on the economic aspects. So in the rural areas, we work with small farmers, and we train and implement what's called agroecology, which is sort of, farmers are always going to farm. They just can do it a lot more responsibly than they're doing it today, because small farmers here have gotten very dependent on agrochemicals, and there's a tremendous amount of erosion, forest loss.
Mhm.
So we basically try and teach farmers, a more sustainable way to grow crops and generate income by conserving their soil and water resources, and a lot of that has to do with reforestation too. And in the more urban communities we work with, we work intensely in vocational education. All these things we do in partnership with the government, and we have a small microloan initiative to get family businesses started with seed capital. So
Wow.
that was in a nutshell. I'm always afraid that I'm spreading our staff too thin geographically and programmatically, but that's probably my U.S. mentality of thinking that we need to keep growing and expanding. And just to top that question off, I mean, we have very replicable models with our programs that can easily be expanded. We've already been growing outwards in concentric circles, to reach more communities, and we could continue to do that as long as we can, raise more funds. So my hope is that we continue to grow to other regions in the country and offer the same services.
No, that was amazing. One, congratulations. Like that's an incredible accomplishment. I mean, most people don't even grow their business, that much, yet alone like a nonprofit, and you're in a foreign country, and all the things going on. That's incredible. It's it's so interesting because as we've kind of like gone back, we've kind of like really gone through like the gamut of your life, if you will. Seems like you've done so many incredible things, from not just like having kids and grandkids, having this incredible career, and then all the work that you've done with this organization. Is in many ways, is Rayo de Sol kind of like your legacy? Is this kind of like that thing that you had talked about, like
Hmm.
what you want to leave behind? And it, tell me more about that. Like, have you had that
Yeah.
conversation with your kids and grandkids? Like when your time is up, like are they going to take it over? Like how's kind of that going?
Yeah, I would definitely say this is, a significant part of my personal legacy. Having worked in a nonprofit sector my whole adult life, I am highly critical of nonprofits, especially in international development, because a significant percentage of nonprofits and development organizations are poorly run, and spend money on poorly designed programs, most of which fail. There's a great documentary. It's called Poverty Inc. I will shout out to the people that made Poverty Inc. If anybody wants to look it up. It really by which this has sort of been an intentional strategy, by large international development organizations that really don't want poverty to disappear because there's a lot of money. It's very lucrative. International development and fund for poverty, I mean, it's multi-million, billion-dollar industry. So with this organization having started, from zero, and fortunately, our board of directors has been very gracious and supportive in allowing us to build out this model of a unique organization. We really want to build an organization that can be differentiated from, the thousands of nonprofits that are doing good work every day. But I like to think that we're doing something special. So as a faith-based organization, we try to remain very loyal to the values that guide us, and we also want to be as technically proficient as any large development organization like the World Bank, or USAID, or Plan International, whichever one you want to choose. And so we're really striving to find that balance where we don't use the human aspect and the values and the faith-based aspect of it, but we incorporate that into designing, program initiatives that really do generate an income. Because a lot of faith-based organizations, honestly, and I might get clobbered for this, are focused on charity, and charity is not development. There's a time for charity. There's a time where you come across an individual or a family or a community that just needs resources, and you just have to give them away. There's a time for that. It can be appropriate in a lot of different circumstances, but that doesn't create lasting change. And what we want to do is create lasting change, and that's the difference between charity and development. And you can only do that if you have well-designed programs. So I hope I didn't lose my coherency in those comments, but we're trying to bridge
No.
that gap between, the human values aspect of the faith-based organization with the technical, effectiveness and proficiency of, a serious international development organization. And that, I hope, is what, my kids and my grandchildren and whoever's left behind, hopefully I go first, will remember and, try and keep alive.
Yeah, it's just what's always so fascinating to me is that when you look at a lot of the massive transformation that happens in a lot of these foreign countries, it's normally not the local people that do it. It's people who come from other places, right? And it's like for you, like there's tons of people that live in Nicaragua, but very few are doing the work that you are. So I want to commend you so much for all the work that you're doing. Can't wait to see you in person and really serve you and your organization. And I'm really just grateful not only for the opportunity to get to go, but to have this conversation. I feel like you and I don't really know each other that well, but like through this conversation, we've gotten to do that pretty quickly. I'm I'm curious for you because one of the things for me is I want to maximize my experience, and being that you've been in Nicaragua for nearly 30 years at this point, what are three things that you would share with me and even just like anybody, if anybody on the trip's coming, to really not only maximize your experience but also to just really immerse yourself in the culture, right? Because a lot of times people get a bit like uncomfortable if you don't speak the language or you're not used to like traditions. I know we were kind of joking earlier about like attire and things like that, certain things just because it's different. But what are like three things that you would share that I could really kind of focus on or lean into to maximize my experience tomorrow?
Yeah, so I think this quote has been attributed to a lot of different people. I've heard it attributed to Mother Teresa and also to Tony Campola. But the saying goes, like let's say somebody asks Mother Teresa, how do you do this every day? How can you possibly, manage this enormous volume of need? And the response was, you just love the person that's in front of you. Right? It's a very simple answer to a very complex question, but there's a lot of truth to it. So, the first thing is to come at this trip or these days we're going to spend together, from a position, excuse me, of a real sincere love. It's a love for humanity. It's a love for people who are suffering. And if you just focus on the person that's in front of you, when people come and we have a project, and I know that, and this is where I'm kind of bicultural. I understand, like, we want to get a lot of stuff done. Like, we want to see that wall painted, we want to see that wall built, and the roof on. But I try and convey to people that's much more important to talk to people and to build a friendship and to build a relationship than to have the paintbrush in your hand 10 hours a day. The wall's going to get painted. I mean, obviously we're going to do work and contribute to a very important project. But for me, it's more important to um, really focus on relationships, and that starts from a position of love. The other thing is service. Service to others. And again, this comes back to a faith-based perspective. You can find so many examples in the gospel and the four gospels of Jesus's primary teaching was to serve others, to serve those who are less fortunate, to serve the least of those. And whether you're a Christian or not, there's so much truth in that teaching. I've come to to really revisit and go back and understand biblical teachings again. And you don't have to be a Christian to take that into your heart and be like, yeah, that's right. I mean, that's really what we're here for. And you guys will meet in the next couple of days some people that live in some pretty desperate conditions. And I think that the thing that always blows me away is how generous and how giving and how open people are when they have so little. So,
Yeah.
that's
Wow.
two. And gosh, the third thing, I think there's no better way to break the ice or to get things rolling than to kick a soccer ball around. No matter where you go on the planet, pull out a ball in a group of kids, and you'll all of a sudden have a free for all with 50 kids chasing after the ball. So it's obviously we want to get a lot of work done, and that school that we're going to be working at has a lot of needs. When you see it, you'll understand exactly what I'm talking about. But also just to focus on the families and the community and the people there, to see their the humanness in them. They're not just some statistics. Oh, there are X number of poor people live in Nicaragua. This is a family, and these are the challenges they face. And this is what I can do to alleviate their suffering a little bit. So we can all do something to alleviate people's suffering every day if we make that conscious decision to do that.
No, that was so powerful, and that was like one of the reasons for me why it was so important for me to go. Was I think about like when I was in those kids position, right? Like how much I would have loved to have like somebody, because a lot of the people that are coming, I think the interesting thing for me was that I'm like significantly younger than a lot of the people. So it's like they're probably closer to my age than anybody else. So it's like I'll really be able to kind of relate and connect with a lot of the kids there. And for me, it was just to kind of bring like inspiration, and it's like this whole message of impossible equals impossible. And the way that you start doesn't have to be how you finish, right? And your organization and the work that you've done for nearly 3 decades there is kind of proof of that, right? Like you shared earlier how you've been able to impact thousands of kids. And that's like, I always think about this, right? Because so many people, when they think about business, it always comes down to like money, and I get it, like we need it to live and all. But at the end of the day, like when everything's all said and done, that's what you're going to remember, is like the impact that the people that you affected. And you're clearly doing a great job of that. And my island man, Enrique, so good to see you, my man. Great to see you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Paul, and shout out to Enrique and Jackie and Timothy that have tuned in.
Yeah.
Enrique's got to get down here sometime soon.
Yeah.
Next
No,
trip.
Pete, this has been an incredible conversation. Before we go, I want to hand it to you. Any final thoughts? I think I have the link. If people want to donate to your organization, I'll drop that in the comments. But any final thoughts and anything that you want to share, I'm gonna hand it to you.
There's Lindsay too. Hey, Lindsay. Lindsay's also on the next for the list for round 2 of the trip. Yeah, obviously we, as a nonprofit, we always need resources. I mean, we're fundraising 365 days a year, so we would love to have people invest in what we're doing. Like I said, it's not an expense but an investment. But also for people to come and visit and get involved and just to learn more. Nicaragua is one small country in a world where there are a lot of countries that suffer from poverty and lack of resources. So it's an opportunity to get intimately involved. I think we offer an opportunity a little bit different than other organizations, that you can come and be on the ground and meet people and meet families and have a very direct and noticeable impact in their lives. So if anybody is interested in coming for a visit or getting involved or hosting a dinner party to raise funds, please feel free to contact me directly. We would love to have you involved. And thank you so much, Paul, for creating this space tonight.
Yeah, Pete, I just want to say thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. I can't wait to immerse myself in the culture and really serve you and your organization. Can't wait. I'm sure it's going to be an experience that I won't ever forget. And if we're doing this every year, you can expect to see me every year. So thank you so much for being here. And yeah, we'll see you tomorrow.
Okay. See you tomorrow at 4 o'clock. Thank you so much. Have a great night.
Have a good day.